LS3 6-speed. The propagation of the LS3 in the aftermarket engine performance world was very quick and complete. We really hadn't seen anything like it since the small block Chevy. And really what the LS3 is an updated version of the small block Chevy. The LS3 doesn't really have any high technology in it. It's built strong. It's got a 6-bolt cross-bolted main. It has updated cylinder heads, much better than anything we had in the old small block days. But essentially it's a 1955 small block Chevy, aluminum block, aluminum heads. It's built to modern standards. So it's no wonder the LS3 became so popular. It didn't really matter what you were looking for, whether it was a street rod, an off-road racing vehicle, circle track, the LS3 pretty much dominated. Before we talk about this build, I think it's appropriate to say that we have a lot of customers that drive our Jeeps that were in Afghanistan or are in Afghanistan, and we hope the best for them. This is one of those unfortunate situations where sometimes the people least qualified to make decisions are the ones in power and have the authority to make those decisions. Ironically, even though the LS3 was one of the most popular engines in the last decade, they're hard to get right now. GM had a crankshaft production problem which shut down the production line of the LS3s. Now remember, when an engine is in current production and it's going into vehicles, they're treated differently. When the LS3 was going into the Camaros 2012, 13, 14, 15, they were readily available and the cost was low. When GM dropped the Camaro production, Camaro Corvette, with the LS3, Holden continued to crank the motors out in their Chevrolet SS, and I don't know, they've got some stuff over there that they were putting it in. But pretty quickly the production LS3 went out, and then GM put it on a secondary line, and now it's essentially a GM performance engine. And the engine is different than the older engine in that you get less components and it costs more. So the price of the LS3 has gone up. You're not getting a flex plate or flywheel. You're not getting exhaust manifolds. They changed the oil pan out from the deep sump Corvette Camaro style, where it basically went all the way to the front of the engine, to the truck style, which has a sump in the back. And actually that's not too bad of a thing, in my opinion. It uses less oil, or it holds less oil. It's like 6.6 quarts instead of 8. But that deep sump in the back does give you a pretty good angle ratio, so you're not going to be starving for oil. So can the LS3 survive in today's environment? The answer is, of course, yes. It's a great engine. It still gets decent economy. Sometimes I get surprised at what kind of economy the LS3 gets, and I think it goes down or back to the higher compression. I think the LS3 is at 10.7 compression ratio, and that extra compression gives you more economy. Now in the VVT motors like the L99 and the LC9, they back the compression off, because when the cam phases, you have the park position and then of course the retarded position, and they have to lower the compression ratio to compensate for the advanced position, otherwise you might get pre-ignition. And the LSs don't have the technology that the LTs have, where they can control the cam and put it anywhere they want. So the bottom line is they need to lower the static compression to deal with that. But with the proper tune, I've done a lot of long distance driving with the LS3, and I've been seeing economy anywhere from 14 to 16 miles to the gallon, even with 40-inch tires, and that's pretty darn good. Now, is it as good as the LT with an 8 or a 10 speed? Probably not. Something I've wanted to talk about with the LS3 based engines for a long time is the horsepower. A lot of guys say, oh, I want the 480, which I think now GM has done some valve springs and called it a 495, I'm not sure. But the 480 horse and the 525 horse have been available for a long time. And of course, there's other variants with carburetors and such. But if we just talk about the GM Performance LS3 engines, a lot of guys look on paper and say, hey, look, this one has 525 horsepower. The production one has 430 horsepower. Why not just get the bigger engine? And there's a lot of reasons why you don't want the bigger engine, and there's some reasons you want the big engine. So essentially the LS3, like I said, is the modern version of the small block Chevy. So it's pretty simple. There's no technology in there like active fuel management to get better economy. There's no variable valve timing. They pretty much pulled all the Gen 4 technology out of the LS3 for one purpose, and that is to make it a performance engine. An engine that can rev up, an engine that can run with a manual transmission, an engine that can run on the track and survive. So they made it as simple as possible. What that means is the LS3 is easily modified. Throwing a cam in an LS3 or an intake is really easy, and there's an entire aftermarket built around it. You can make an LS3 anything you want, 400 horsepower, 500 horsepower, 600 horsepower plus, without a supercharger. In fact, we got a 660 horsepower LS3 based engine in the shop. It has been punched out, I believe, to 7 liters, which is about a 427. It's got a monster intake on it, cam and all that stuff. So it's going to be all rumpity rump rump, and it's going to be like like an old muscle car from the early 70s. In fact, I have a LS6 Chevelle, if you guys know what that is. It's a 454. It was rated at 425 horsepower. And it's a pretty rough engine. I mean, it's a very powerful engine, but it's got a rough idle. It's hard to start and all that. I used to say about that engine that it would pass anything except a gas station. And it's not so much true with the LS3. Some of these high horsepower LS3s with modern technology and the fact that we now have computers controlling the fuel delivery. Remember that LS6 had a Holley 4-barrel, and yes, while you could get pretty good results with tuning a Holley 4-barrel, you're never going to get near the results that you could with computer fuel injection. In fact, when it comes to off-roading, I went through that transitional period of carburetors to throttle bodies to fuel injection, port fuel injection. And it wasn't a small, it was a giant improvement off-road when we went to fuel injection, because now we didn't have float bowls that could flood. We had, I remember the old Carters, which I think you guys call Edelbrocks now. You could get the off-road needle and seats. They were spring-loaded to try to keep that float from bouncing. But the end result was on really steep hills and climbs, we went to a center pivot float, we spring-loaded the needle and seat, we tried to keep the float level or the fuel level in the bowl low, and it worked most of the time, but you still had some flooding going up and down hills. Fuel injection changed all that. The Germans could fly inverted in World War II with their fuel-injected engines, where the Allies had to depend on some very sophisticated carburetors just to pull high negative G maneuvers. So fuel injection was used to the off-road market. Getting back to the cam and the horsepower, there's a lot of ways to make 500 horsepower. A lot of you guys want 500 horsepower. You could take a small engine, put a supercharger or turbocharger on it. You could take a V8 and cam it. We're going to bring the LT in on this discussion because the way the LT makes 500 horsepower is different than the way the LS3 makes 500 horsepower. So if we take the GM Performance LS3 engines, the 430 horse is essentially the same as a production engine. It has a very slight rumble at idle. It's barely noticeable, but it's there. The LS3 was designed for the Camaro and the Corvette with a manual transmission. They deleted AFM, that's active fuel management 4-cylinder mode. They didn't go to variable valve timing. They kept it as simple as possible. And with the camshaft that's in it, it's kind of what we used to call an RV cam in the old days. So it's a little bit more aggressive than a stock cam that idles completely smooth, or a smog cam as we used to call them. But that engine's still capable of 430 horsepower. And it's an awesome combination. You have really good drivability on and off road. You have really good power in the mid-range. You have good cruising on the highway. You're not really giving up anything on the lower end when you launch, even with larger tires. It's just an excellent all-around engine, and the engine I highly recommend if you want to go with an LS3 based engine. If we move up to the 480 and the 525 horsepower engine, GM's getting more horsepower by putting a bigger cam in it. By putting a bigger cam in it, we can raise the cylinder pressure at the higher RPMs. We can use that with a ram effect, and I've explained this many times, but the incoming column of air can actually compress into the engine, increasing volumetric efficiency. In fact, the old Can-Am engine could exceed 100% volumetric efficiency. What that means is you're cramming more air into the engine than the displacement of the engine. And that's great. You're building more horsepower up at higher RPM. But what's the downside? Well, the downside is when you slow that motor down, that intake valve is closing after bottom dead center. We wanted to leave that intake valve open after bottom dead center at high RPM because the column of air is still rushing in and you're getting more air fuel charge into the chamber. You slow the motor down, now as the piston goes up, it pushes that air fuel charge back into the intake, disrupting the intake airflow characteristics, and then hence you get that rough idle. Fuel injection has made this a lot more tolerable than the old carburetors, because carburetors had Venturis that would suck the air fuel charge into the intake and then into the engine, where fuel injection we can inject it directly behind the intake valve. So fuel injection definitely helped with the big camshafts. With the big cam, you're definitely going to have more horsepower, especially in the mid and upper RPM ranges. You don't want to run active fuel management. You want to make sure all your components are upgraded to handle the extra RPM. The biggest downside though is you're going to lose bottom end torque. When you go to a big cam, your idle is going to be soft. It's going to be soggy when you take off. And a lot of guys don't like that. And when they get their 500 horsepower engine, they say, you know, I really thought that this 500 horsepower engine was going to be better in every way, but it's not. It's better on the top end, but it's not better on the bottom end. So not only Motec, but I'm noticing all of our competitors have been shying away from the high horsepower cammed engines. Now remember, I've been doing cammed engines for 30 years, and that's how we used to make power. We didn't have the technology of today. We didn't have variable valve timing. We didn't have direct injection. We didn't have all the stuff that we got today. So you put a big carburetor on it, made the intake and exhaust flow as much as you could, and cam it. And we were pushing 400, 500, 600 horsepower out of big block Chevys. I've actually had a couple of customers bring in cammed LS3s recently. Well, actually, one of them was a cammed 6-liter. And here's my opinion on that. If you get a 5.3 and cam it, you're going to basically have the power of a 6.0, but you're not going to have the drivability of a 6.0. If you get a 6.0 and you cam it, you're going to have basically the power of a 6.2, but you're not going to have the drivability of a 6.2, and you're probably going to have more money into it, because to buy a 6.2 versus camming, pulling the intake and heads and buying the kit from Texas Speed or whoever, you're probably going to have more money into a 6.0 that's cammed than you're going to have into a 6.2. So why not just get the 6.2 and maintain that drivability? And that's still my philosophy today. Buy the horsepower you want. Now, if you want that hot rod muscle car experience, then do it. I did a build for a guy in Arizona not long ago. We put side pipes on it and made it just like a Corvette, and manual transmission, all that. And if that's what you want, that's great. But if you want the best all-around drivability on and off-road, go with a 430 horsepower LS3. It's a fantastic engine. The one I'm driving right now, your wife would drive it to the store with no problem. You could cruise it on the highway for 1,000 miles. It's a fantastic engine. I must say, driving those cammed engines is starting to bother me now. Maybe I'm getting old, but I like to come to a stop in traffic and have the engine idle smoothly, and I'm not breathing all those hydrocarbons and fumes. And then when I'm off-road, I want that instant bottom-end torque, something you really can't get with a big cammed engine. I said the LT would come in this discussion, and now is a good time. The LT basically produces similar horsepower to a cammed LS3 or LS engine, but maintains the drivability. And you say, how does it do that? Well, first it bumps that compression way up. We're going from about 10.7 in an LS3, 10.7, 10.9 LS3 Hemis, that's about where they're at. And we're bumping that up to 11.5 to 1 compression. And how do we get away with that? We do it with continuous variable valve timing. So we're phasing the cam, which means we have control of cylinder pressure. We also have direct injection, which is more efficient. What this allows us to do is utilize that cylinder pressure when we need it. And we can avoid spark knock or pre-ignition by advancing the cam, retarding the cam. Essentially, retarding the cam will lower cylinder pressure, and that will back off the spark knock. At the same time, we got direct injection, which is more efficient in the combustion chamber. So what we have now is an engine putting out cylinder pressure similar to a cammed earlier engine, older generation engine, but still idling at 500 RPM. That's the beauty of the LT. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can get that 500 horsepower that you want in the LS3, but you can still maintain the drivability of that stock 430 horse LS3. Then of course, when we combine that with the 8 and the 10-speed transmission, that keeps the engine in its power band longer. So the overall result is just better in every way. Now, is it dramatically better? No. You know, it's not double digits like it used to be with when we went from the small block to the first generation 3 LS. That was a huge improvement. But it is significant. And if you look at SEMA in the aftermarket today, everybody's migrating towards the LT1 and the other LT engines because of their technology. When Motec did their first LT swap in 2016, that was 5 years ago, most of the aftermarket engine conversion companies, SEMA, weren't into the LT at all. It was new technology. They were talking about the reliability of the direct injection and other issues with the transmissions. So it was kind of put aside. But as the years went on, the LT matured and it proved that this technology was just superior. Now, of course, the Europeans and the Americans have other high-tech engines. Look at the Ford Ecotec that are putting out high horsepower. But as far as a base, fundamental GM V8 or American V8 hot rod engine, the LT is it. The Hemi doesn't have the technology. The LSs don't have the technology. Ford makes some really cool high-tech engines, but they're not really suitable for the JK due to their size and cost and all that. So if you look at what the LT offers, especially now that the LSs are getting difficult to get and the LTs are getting easier to get, because remember, they're in production. GM's cranking them out. So they're going to auction off older engines to distributors, which we're going to buy from, and they're going to load up GM performance with these engines, which they are. You got Connect and Cruise LT1s, LT4s, LT5s. I heard a rumor they might even be doing the new 6.6. But let's not forget the LS engines. They've carried the torch for about a decade, and they're still very viable. They can still haul your JK while getting better economy than your V6 engine. But the days of the LS engine being easier to get and lower cost are going to come to the end soon, and we're going to have to switch over to the LT. As long as GM is offering these LS3 engines, we're going to be installing them because they are excellent engines. And I got to say, when I jump into an old LS, I've been driving a lot of LTs, as you guys know, especially the 8 and the 10 speeds, and it's a different sensation, it's a different feeling. But when I get into an old LS3, it feels like the old days, the 70s, 80s, you know, the 3-speed hydramatics. The power delivery of the engine is very traditional as you rev it up. So if you're a traditional guy and you want that traditional feeling of an old 3 or 4-speed small block Chevy, then get yourself an LS3 6L80. You won't be disappointed. So we're going to take this LS3 to the mountain, and we'll see you soon.